Alright, so Shai here again, a quick video about the wiring within the printer, and try to go over pretty quickly the different gauges and what kind of wires to use and wires to not use and stuff I learned as I'm going through this. So one of the good videos to watch is by Tom, and can't pronounce his last name, but I'll link to it here, which talks about the different types of wiring that you need and when to use what wiring, but basically went with Cat 6. And you can see in the back a little bit easier, but there's a Cat 6 coming up here. The reason for Cat 6, if you can actually see in there, is it has that shielding in between the different lines. Now, this might not be 100% necessary, but some cheap fans do generate noise on the line. You don't want those interfering with your steppers. So it's nice to have the shielding in between, and it's really not that much more money for that wiring. So the nice thing is, too, that there's 4 pairs of 8 wires twisted individually here, and so that gives you 4 for your stepper, 2 for a fan, and then 2 for something else. So like in the case of the front here, we have that same Cat 6, and actually I ran 2 Cat 6 just to have some extra wires here. But you have for the extruder, for the extruder motor, you have one for the fan that's back here. You have one for the pause switch that will be used in the future. You have one for the Y stop, maybe another one for LEDs, right? So you got plenty of available amperage within that wire, and I believe that Cat 6 is usually 24, 22 gauge, depending where you are. Now, for the rest of the wire, I'm kind of going through here. It's a bit of a mess, but for things like your heated bed, even though I'm using a dual zone, there's not really any voltage here. I still used 16 gauge wiring. Same thing for the 5 and 11 amp wiring that's going from the power supply back to the ramps. I used 12 gauge, just to be on the safe side. You probably don't have to. 16 is fine. 14 is fine too. I would suggest staying in 12 and 14 range. I like the 12 personally. And then for other, simple wiring, like, putting a little USB plug in here, 24 gauge is fine. I ran another line up here because I wanted it 24 gauge. The 12 volt on the LED here could have also been 24 gauge. So you have plenty of lines that could be 24 gauge if you want to. Anything for these fans individually could be 24 gauge. So I would say a good place to start is really get yourself some 12, 16, 24, and then Cat 6. And you can probably consolidate better if you understand the wiring and amperage and all that stuff a little better than we do. But that usually works. For the ground wiring back here, I believe this is 12 gauge. You could probably go with 14 as well. These are all very short. There's not a high current running through them. You'll notice mine is not, this one's not attached to anything at the moment. Should be going to the inlet down here. Just a caution, if you're going with the black frame, the whole frame doesn't get grounded because of the black anodizing. But the green is your ground wiring there. Again, that could be 8 gauge, or not 8 gauge, sorry, 12, 14, or 16 should be fine. I use the Waco connectors. This could be terminal blocks. Your ramps or LCD controller, depending on what cables actually came with it. In my case, they were long enough to reach the display up here, and then I flattened them when I put them in this nylon sleeving. But yours might not be long enough, so you might have to put your display lower, or you might have to buy longer cables. Just remember that they are 2x5 pin, and they make sure that you get the 2.54 spacing, not the 1 point pitch. That's very common out there. Again, you can see kind of the rat's nest of wiring that should be cleaned up. But this is a mix of some Cat 5 cabling coming in, some 24 gauge wire coming in. There's really no 16 and 12 gauge coming in here. I tried some speaker wire that, just a simple headphone type of wire. Really did not work well. I would not recommend, cheap headphone wire or speaker wire type stuff. For the 12 gauge, I would suggest to definitely be using silicone wire. The 12 gauge is a pain to work with. It's very difficult to move around, a very stiff wire. You can actually see it down here. I think this is 12. No, actually, you can create that
this back here is the 12 gauge in comparison with the 16 gauge that's here. So a bit hard to see, but if I overlay these two together, you can see this red one here is 12 gauge, this black is 16. These are just very stiff and hard to work with. You know, if you're trying to route the wires nicely, I would definitely try to invest in the 12 gauge silicone wire. That's a little more pricey, but definitely still worthwhile. And any of the wiring going to the extruder carriage is a bit of a mess right now, but again, that's just a Cat 6. The only thing that I will call out is for the hot end, we actually use, and I'll walk over here real quick, you can see my mess of wires in this drawer. I even bought some 8 gauge, which ended up being too thick. Big 100-foot spool of 24 gauge. But you can see this is actually what we used for the hot ends. This is a 16 gauge wire. It's called, I think, 16 by 4. So you have 4 wires in here, sleeved in this PVC jacket. Probably overkill for the 3 or 4 amps that the hot end generates, but nice to have that extra wiring in case you need it. This is very stiff, which actually comes in handy when you're trying to loom this, and this actually does eventually stand up nice and straight if you're trying to get that sort of Ultimaker arc type of look. So that, I believe, covers it for all the wiring. Thank you for watching.